Play this piano. I'll marry you. The voice, slick with the chill of expensive whiskey and absolute power, sliced through the curated murmur of the gala. It belonged to Mr. Kwan, a man whose tailored suit cost more than a car and whose smile never quite reached his eyes. He was gesturing with his glass, the amber liquid sloshing against the crystal, towards the corner of the grand ballroom. There, bathed in the buttery glow of a recessed spotlight, a young woman in a plain, gray maid's uniform was mopping the floor. Her name was Kira. She was 22, the target of his joke. 100 pairs of eyes, belonging to Seoul's elite, turned from Kwan to the girl. They were a pack, sensing the blood in the water. Laughter followed, first a tentative titter, then a confident, rolling wave of amusement. It was the sound of money laughing at poverty, the sound of status mocking service. Have you ever been the punchline? Not in a friendly roast, but in a joke designed to remind you of your precise, insignificant place in the world. It feels like the air has been stolen from your lungs, your skin suddenly too tight, your every movement a clumsy spectacle. Kira felt it then. The heat rising in her cheeks, the weight of 100 gazes pressing down on her like a physical force. She had been invisible just a moment before, a functional ghost gliding along the edges of opulence, her existence acknowledged only by its utility. Now, she was hypervisible, a specimen pinned to a board for public examination. The object of their ridicule wasn't just her, but the piano. It was a Bosendorfer Imperial Grand, a 9-foot leviathan of polished ebony, its lacquer so deep it looked like a pool of liquid night. It was a concert instrument, a king sitting enthroned in Kwan's monument to himself, a piece of art worth more than the combined annual salaries of his entire household staff. The juxtaposition was the core of the joke. The girl in the $50 uniform and the $500,000 instrument. An ant being invited to pilot a spaceship. Kwan's lips curled into a wider, more performative smile. He was a master of the room, a conductor of social currents. "What's wrong?" he called out, his voice booming with false magnanimity. "Afraid you'll scratch it?" More laughter. Sharper this time. It was a game, and everyone understood the rules. The maid's humiliation was the price of admission. Kwan was demonstrating his power not by shouting or threatening, but by casually, cruelly, playing with a human being as if she were a toy. Kira froze, her hands tightening on the cold metal handle of the mop. The damp gray strings of the mop had dripped onto the marble, each drop a tiny, echoing tick in the sudden, expectant silence that followed the laughter. Her world, which had been a simple equation of hours worked versus bills paid, had just been shattered. She was no longer just a cleaner. She was a challenge. Adare. A public spectacle waiting to happen. Her eyes lifted from the floor, past the gleaming shoes and silk hems, and met Mr. Kwan's. His gaze was empty of everything but bored, predatory amusement. The 4:17 a.m. alarm didn't scream. It beeped, a pathetic, tired sound from a cheap plastic clock on a nightstand cluttered with pharmacy receipts and a half-empty glass of water. This was Kira's world, a cramped one-bedroom apartment 45 minutes and 2 bus transfers from Mr. Kwan's palatial estate. The air smelled of stale coffee and the vague, medicinal scent of her mother's nebulizer. A montage of her life, if one were to be filmed, would be a blur of motion under harsh fluorescent lights. 5:03 a.m. Spooning oatmeal into her mother's mouth, the older woman's hands too frail and trembling to hold the spoon herself. 5:45 a.m. The first bus, its windows fogged with the breath of the city's unseen workforce. Cleaners, cooks, security guards, all sharing the same pre-dawn quiet, the same weary slump in their shoulders. Kira would hold the worn metal pole, her gaze distant, the rhythms of the bus a familiar, lulling beat. This was the invisible transit that powered the gleaming city. Her uniform was her ticket to this world, a cloak of invisibility. In the gray polyester dress, she was not Kira, the girl who once dreamed of concert halls. She was the help, a function, not a person. People's eyes slid right over her. She was a background element, part of the scenery, as unremarkable as a light fixture or a potted plant. But around her neck, tucked beneath the modest collar of her uniform, was a small, tarnished silver locket. It was her grandmother's. It didn't hold a picture. It held a promise. Inside, folded into a tiny, fragile square, was a miniature, hand-scribed piece of sheet music. The opening bars of Chopin's Fantasie Impromptu. Her grandmother, a janitor who cleaned a music school for 50 years, had saved every penny to buy a rickety, out-of-tune upright piano. These hands, she would tell a young Kira, holding up her own, calloused and chapped from bleach and harsh soaps, they clean, so yours can create. Kira's hands were not soft. They were strong, the pads of her fingers bearing the faint, hardened ridges of a lifetime of practice. Not just on ivory keys, but on the worn-down plastic of a cheap keyboard in her room, headphones on, playing to an audience of one in the dead of night. Those hands knew sacrifice. They knew the ache of holding a job, then another, of balancing her mother's mounting medical bills, an endless, terrifying cascade of numbers, against the desperate need to keep that one, sacred part of herself alive. The job at Mr. Kwan's mansion was a godsend, the pay just enough to cover the new medication her mother's doctor insisted on.
It was a lifeline.
So she polished floors that were already clean, dusted surfaces that held no dust, and learned the art of becoming furniture. She learned to muffle her footsteps, to avert her gaze, to make her presence as small and unobtrusive as the hum of the expensive air purifiers. The work was a means to an end. It was survival. The humiliation was an unspoken part of the job description, a tax levied on the poor for the crime of needing money. She endured it, for her mother, for the promise in the locket. Tonight was a performance, not just for Kira, but for Mr. Kwan. He stood at the center of the room, a sun king around which all the lesser planets of Seoul's high society orbited. He wasn't just a mafia boss, a whispered title that clung to him like expensive cologne. He was a master of public relations. His cruelty was strategic, his generosity a weapon. The gala itself was a testament to his skill. The event was a fundraiser for the National Music Conservatory, a lavish display of his supposed patronage of the arts. He would make a grand, 7-figure donation later in the evening, an act that would be photographed, tweeted, and reported on, washing his reputation clean in the cleansing fire of philanthropy. Look at Mr. Kwan, the headlines would say, a pillar of the community, a lover of culture. They wouldn't mention the whispers of his business dealings, the fear in his rivals' eyes, or the casual cruelty he deployed to keep his own court in line. He treated attention as a currency, and tonight he was minting it. Every detail was curated for maximum effect. The champagne was Dom Perignon, the flowers flown in from Holland, the guest list a who's who of power and influence. His watch was a Patek Philippe, a subtle but clear signal of his station. When he spoke, people leaned in. When he laughed, they laughed with him. He was gravity. The incident with the maid was not an accident. It was a calculated piece of theater. It served a purpose. It reminded everyone in the room, from the sycophantic politicians to the nervous business partners who held the power. He could humiliate someone for sport, and they would not only allow it, they would applaud it. It was a demonstration of absolute social dominance. He was building an image brick by polished brick. The generous donor, the charming host, the man so secure in his position that he could afford to be playful, even if his play was someone else's pain. The optics were everything. The media was present, Not just tabloid reporters, but legitimate arts journalists, there to cover his grand donation. He was creating a narrative, and in his story, he was the hero. The maid was merely a prop, a footnote in the grand spectacle of his benevolence. Mrs. Park, the head housekeeper and a woman who had worked for Kwan's family for 30 years, watched from the periphery. She was a gatekeeper, a silent observer who understood the delicate ecosystem of the mansion better than anyone. She had seen countless acts of casual cruelty and performative kindness. She recognized talent, and she had seen it in Kira from the beginning, in the quiet dignity the girl carried, in the way her fingers would sometimes trace invisible scales on a dusty tabletop. Mrs. Park saw the trap for what it was, and a flicker of something, fear, anger, a desperate hope, crossed her stern, lined face. She knew Kwan was not a man to be crossed, but she also knew that some spirits could not be contained by a uniform. The trap was set. The silence in the ballroom had become a living entity, thick and suffocating. Mr. Kwan's challenge, "Play this piano, I'll marry you," hung in the air, its absurdity and cruelty echoing in the stillness. It was a perfect, closed loop of humiliation. If she refused, she was a coward, admitting she was nothing more than a lowly maid, cowering before her master. Her defiance would be read as insubordination, a fireable offense. If she accepted and failed, the most likely outcome in everyone's mind, she would be a global laughingstock. The moment was being recorded on at least 50 smartphones, their small, dark lenses aimed at her like a firing squad. The scene was primed for viral consumption. Hapless maid humiliated by billionaire after trying to play concert piano. The algorithm was hungry, and Kwan had just served it a feast. The crowd was a character in itself, a chorus of whispers that tightened the net around Kira. "She's actually considering it," a woman in a diamond necklace hissed to her companion. "The audacity, poor thing," another murmured, the pity in her voice more insulting than outright scorn. "He's put her in an impossible position." They were spectators at a Roman circus, thrilled by the impending slaughter. Kwan, seeing her hesitation, decided to heighten the drama. He walked slowly, deliberately, towards the Bosendorfer, his expensive leather shoes making no sound on the thick Persian rugs. He ran a hand over the piano's flawless black surface, a gesture of ownership, of possession. "It's a beautiful instrument," he said, his voice now a silken purr that carried to every corner of the room. "A Bosendorfer Imperial, 9.5 feet of Austrian genius. It has 97 keys, not 88. Those extra 9 keys in the bass. They give it a resonance, a soul, that other pianos can only dream of." He was giving a lecture, flaunting his knowledge, turning the screw. "It deserves to be played by a master." "Are you a master, little mouse?" The diminutive nickname was another casual flick of the whip. He turned back to her, an eyebrow raised in mock inquiry. The pressure chamber was now at maximum. The social risk was total public shame. The practical risk was her job, her only means of keeping her mother alive. The symbolic risk was her very soul, the quiet, hidden part of her that her grandmother had nurtured. Mrs. Park caught her eye from across the room. The older woman's face was a mask of stoicism, but her eyes conveyed a single, powerful message. Be you. It wasn't advice. It was a plea. It was permission. It was the final push Kira needed, a reminder of a world beyond this gilded cage, a world of promises kept and legacies honored. Have you ever had a moment where your entire life seems to narrow to a single point, a single decision? All your past, all your fears, all your hopes, converging on one sharp, terrifying, clarifying instant. This was that moment for Kira. The world shrank until it contained only 3 things: the suffocating weight of 100 pairs of eyes, the cold, mocking gleam of the Bosendorfer, and the steady, rhythmic pulse of her own heart. The internal calculus began, a frantic, silent accounting of losses and gains. Risk, absolute, soul-crushing humiliation in front of the world. The video would live forever online, a permanent monument to her shame. Reward. What reward? The absurd, insulting promise of marriage? There was no reward. Risk. Losing her job. The $2,800 a month she needed for her mother's care, for the rent on their tiny apartment, for the food on their table. Losing this job meant a catastrophic failure. It meant facing her mother's worsening illness without the medicine that held it at bay. Reward. A flicker of defiance? A moment of standing up for herself that would cost her everything? It didn't add up. The math was simple, brutal, and clear. Keep your head down, apologize, and pray he forgets. Mop the floor, collect your paycheck, and survive. That was the logical choice. The sane choice. But logic doesn't account for the soul. It doesn't factor in a grandmother's sacrifice. It can't quantify the weight of a promise worn in a locket against your skin. She felt the cool metal of the locket through the thin fabric of her uniform. She thought of her grandmother's hands, cleaning toilets so that hers could learn to fly. She thought of the music, the secret language that had been her only true companion through years of poverty and grief. To refuse now wasn't just about avoiding humiliation. To refuse would be to agree with them. To agree that she was only a maid. That the gray uniform was her skin, not just a costume she wore for money. To agree that the music inside her was worthless because her station in life was low. It would be the ultimate betrayal of her grandmother, of herself. A slow push-in on her face. The frantic fear in her eyes began to recede, replaced by something else. A quiet fire, a controlled rage, a sudden, profound stillness. She looked at her own faint reflection in the polished marble floor, a distorted, gray shape. Then she lifted her head and looked directly at Mr. Kwan. The fear was gone. In its place was a resolve as hard and clear as diamond. She took a slow, deep breath. The cacophony of the room, the whispers, the weight of the stairs, it all faded into a distant hum. There was only the piano, waiting. It wasn't a threat anymore. It was an invitation. She let the mop handle slip from her fingers. It clattered onto the marble, the sound shockingly loud in the tense silence. She didn't flinch. With a grace that seemed utterly alien to her drab uniform, she took one step, then another. The decision was made. As she passed a stunned waiter, she spoke, her voice not loud, but clear and steady, cutting through the silence with the precision of a scalpel. "Okay," she said. Just that one word. But in it, a world of defiance. "I'll play." The walk from the edge of the room to the piano was the longest 50 feet of Kira's life. It was a gauntlet of judgment. Every eye in the room followed her, 100 tiny spotlights of contempt and disbelief. The rustle of silk, the clink of ice in a glass, the almost inaudible sigh of someone's boredom. She heard it all. Her gray polyester uniform felt like sandpaper against her skin. It was a symbol of her station, a costume for the role they had assigned her. The help, the punchline. Now, that uniform was walking toward the most sacred object in the room, an act of supreme transgression. A gasp went through the crowd as she reached the piano bench. It was a collective intake of breath, a mix of horror and morbid curiosity. This was actually happening. The maid was going to touch the Bosendorfer.
She didn't hesitate.
She sat, and in that simple act, the posture of the room shifted. She did not perch on the edge of the bench like an intruder. She sat with a centered, grounded posture of someone who belonged there. Her back was straight. Her shoulders, which had been slumped in the weary posture of a laborer just minutes before, were now relaxed, poised. She placed her hands in her lap, taking a moment, owning the silence. What does a miracle look like before it happens? Does it announce itself with trumpets and lightning?
No.
Sometimes it looks like a 22-year-old girl in a cheap uniform, sitting at a piano in a room full of people who despise her. It looks quiet. It looks unassuming. It looks like nothing at all. And then it becomes everything. Kira looked down at the keys. 97 of them. A vast, intimidating expanse of black and white. They weren't just keys. They were a language she had spoken in secret her entire life. She reached out and gently touched the cool, smooth surface of the ivory. It felt like coming home. The smell of lemon wax and old, noble wood filled her senses, cutting through the cloying cloud of expensive perfumes. She closed her eyes for a single, long second. In that darkness, she wasn't in Mr. Kwan's ballroom. She was in a small, dusty room with her grandmother, her small fingers stumbling over the keys of a second-hand upright while her grandmother hummed along, smelling of bleach and love. "Feel the music, baby." Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. "Don't just play the notes. Tell the story." She opened her eyes. The story. That's what they were about to get. Not a little tune. Not a clumsy recital. A story. A reckoning. She flexed her fingers, the muscles and tendons in her hands awake and alive. These were not the hands of a maid. They were the hands of a virtuoso, forged in discipline and sacrifice. The crowd watched, a sea of smug, expectant faces. Kwan stood with his arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips, ready for the inevitable, discordant plinking to begin. He was ready for his punchline. He had no idea he was about to become it. Kira lifted her hands. They hovered over the keys for a beat of pure, unadulterated silence. The entire room held its breath. The air was so still you could hear the fizz of champagne bubbles dying in 100 glasses. And then it began. It was not a tentative note. It was not the clumsy fumbling they expected. It was an explosion. A torrent of sound so complex, so powerful, so utterly masterful that it felt like a physical blow. She had chosen Liszt. Not just any Liszt. She had chosen La Campanella. The Little Bell, one of the most punishingly difficult pieces ever written for the piano. A piece that professional concert pianists train their entire lives to master, and many still fear. The opening, with its rapid, high-pitched repetitions, didn't sound like a bell from her fingers. It sounded like shattering glass, like 1,000 tiny hammers striking with impossible speed and precision. Her right hand became a blur, a hummingbird's wing, while her left hand leaped across the keyboard, covering massive, breathtaking intervals with an accuracy that defied belief. The sound that erupted from the Bosendorfer was not music. It was a force of nature. It was the sound of a storm breaking, of a prayer being answered, of a soul being laid bare. The extra bass keys of the Imperial Grand, the ones Kwan had so arrogantly lectured her about, now roared to life under her command, adding a resonant, terrifying depth to the piece. The music filled every inch of the cavernous room, seeming to press the air from the lungs of the stunned audience. The initial shock on the faces of the guests curdled into disbelief, then into sheer, slack-jawed awe. Glasses froze halfway to lips. Whispers died in throats. The smirks vanished, replaced by masks of utter astonishment. Mr. Kwan's condescending smile dissolved as if wiped away by an invisible hand. His arms uncrossed. He took a half step forward, his eyes wide, unable to process what he was seeing and hearing. The little mouse in the gray uniform was playing with the power and fury of a vengeful god. The music was a narrative. It told the story of every 4 a.m. alarm, every grueling bus ride, every casual insult swallowed, every hour of secret, desperate practice in the dead of night. It was the sound of her grandmother's love, of a promise kept, of a genius that had been hidden, polished in darkness, waiting for its moment of blinding light. Her body was one with the instrument. She wasn't playing the piano. She was channeling something through it. The music flowed through her, a current of pure, unadulterated talent that was both terrifying and sublime. The phones were still out, but the intention had changed. They were no longer recording a joke. They were documenting a legend being born. The last chord of La Campanella hung in the air, a final, shimmering question mark that vibrated with an almost visible intensity.
Then silence.
A silence more profound, more absolute than any that had come before. It stretched for 1 second.
2.
3. It was a sacred, held beat where the world was recalibrating, where 100 brains were struggling to reconcile the girl in the gray dress with the monstrous, beautiful sound that had just consumed them.
4. 5.
The spell broke. It wasn't applause that started it. It was a single, choked sob from the back of the room. Mrs. Park, her stern facade shattered, had her hand pressed to her mouth, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. Then the applause began. It was not the polite, rhythmic clapping of a cultured audience. It was an eruption.
A roar.
A thunderous, visceral explosion of sound that shook the crystal chandeliers. People were leaping to their feet, their faces a mixture of shock and reverence. The sound was a tidal wave of vindication that washed over Kira. The chorus of mockery had transformed into a chorus of worship. The phones, which had been instruments of her potential humiliation, were now tools of her ascension. The hashtag they were imagining was no longer hashtag Maid fail. It was hashtag piano angel. Hashtag Kwanhu. The algorithm had flipped. The crowd, that fickle beast, had turned on its master. Their awe for the music was now mingled with a dawning, delicious contempt for the man who had so badly misjudged its source. Their applause was not just for her. It was against him. And the consequence cascade began immediately. A distinguished, silver-haired man was already pushing his way through the stunned crowd. It was Maestro Ian Richter, the celebrated conductor of the London Philharmonic, in town to consult with the conservatory. His face was pale, his eyes burning with the manic light of discovery. Incredible, he was muttering, shouldering a politician aside.
Who is she?
I need to know who she is. Behind him, a sharp-faced woman with a press pass that read New York Times, Arts and Culture, was speaking rapidly into her phone. Kill the piece on the donation, she snapped. The story isn't the money. It's the maid. Get me everything you can on her. Now, a portly man in a tuxedo, a board member from Juilliard, looked at Kwan with unconcealed disgust before turning his attention fully to the piano, a look of pure, predatory opportunity on his face. Mr. Kwan was frozen in the center of the room. The gravity had shifted. He was no longer the sun. He was a dead planet, his orbit decayed, his light extinguished. He had built a stage to display his power, and on that stage, his maid had just become a god, leaving him a mortal, foolish man stranded in the sudden, harsh glare of her light. His trap had not only failed, it had sprung shut on him, its steel jaws clamping down on his most prized possession, his image. He was irrelevant in his own home. Kira stood up from the piano bench. Her legs felt unsteady, the adrenaline of the performance leaving her trembling. The thunderous ovation washed over her, a sound so overwhelming it felt like a physical pressure. She looked out at the sea of faces, no longer cruel and mocking, but filled with a startling, intense reverence. They were looking at her not as a function, but as a phenomenon. She saw Maestro Richter fighting his way towards her, his hand outstretched. She saw the flash of cameras, the rapt attention of people who, 10 minutes ago, wouldn't have acknowledged her existence if she had been on fire. She turned her head and saw Mr. Kwan. He looked smaller, somehow. The arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by a stunned, slack-jawed stillness. He was trying to compose his face into a smile, to reclaim the moment, to act as if this was what he had intended all along, a brilliant display of hidden talent he had cleverly unearthed. But it was a pathetic, transparent failure. The shock and humiliation were too raw, too visible in his eyes. He had been publicly neutered, in his own house, with his own prop, by his own victim. Kira's gaze swept past him, dismissing him, and found Mrs. Park. The head housekeeper was no longer crying. She was smiling, a broad, beautiful smile of pure, unadulterated pride. It was a smile of vindication, a lifetime of swallowed injustices released in one triumphant moment. That smile was worth more to Kira than the entire room's applause. She gave a small, simple bow. It was not the bow of a servant. It was the bow of an artist who has given her all and knows it was enough. She said nothing. The music had said everything. It had spoken of her pain, her hope, her history, and her power. To speak now would be to diminish it. As she straightened up, Maestro Richter finally reached her. He grabbed her hands, his touch surprisingly gentle. He turned them over, looking at her calloused fingers with the awe of an archaeologist discovering a priceless artifact. "My dear girl," he said, his voice thick with a German accent and emotion. "In my 60 years, I have heard Horowitz. I have heard Rubinstein. Tonight I heard you.
Who are you?
Where did you come from?" Before she could answer, the man from Juilliard was at his elbow. "Forget that. Where are you going? Do you have representation? We need to talk." Immediately, a woman thrust a business card into her hand. "The Philharmonic. We will fly you to London.
Tomorrow.
First class. We will cancel our scheduled soloist. You will play with us." Offers began to rain down on her. A deluge of opportunities, of contracts, of a future she had only ever allowed herself to dream of in the most secret corners of her heart. She didn't walk back to her mop. She didn't look back at Mr. Kwan. She took Maestro Richter's offered arm, let him shield her from the sudden, ravenous crush of the crowd, and walked towards the door, leaving the ballroom, her gray uniform and her old life behind her. The metamorphosis was complete. 6 months later, the on-screen text would read, "Carnegie Hall, sold out." The camera pans across a sea of expectant faces, the hushed, reverent silence of an audience about to witness something legendary. Then it finds her.
Kira.
She walks onto the world's most famous stage, not in a gray polyester uniform, but in a gown of midnight blue velvet that seems to drink the light. She is no longer invisible. She is the most visible person in the world right now. She sits at the Steinway, the spotlight carving her out of the darkness, and as she prepares to play, there is no fear. There is only a quiet, powerful sense of purpose. Her debut album, titled The Bosendorfer Session, a live recording from that fateful night captured on 100 iPhones and professionally mixed from a journalist's high-quality audio, had gone viral, then platinum. It shattered classical music's streaming records, a raw, explosive performance that the world couldn't get enough of. And what of Mr. Kwan? The viral video of his cruel wager, followed by the earth-shattering performance of his Maid, had done what no prosecutor or rival could. It had ruined him. The story wasn't about his power anymore. It was about his foolishness, his spectacular miscalculation. The optics he had so carefully cultivated were destroyed. Labeled a bully and a fool, his mystique evaporated. Business partners grew wary. Banks began to call in loans. Whispers of audits and investigations, once held at bay by his fearsome reputation, now had teeth. His downfall wasn't a dramatic shootout. It was a quiet, relentless cascade of consequences, a slow-motion collapse triggered by a single, arrogant sentence. He had become a meme, a cautionary tale about underestimating the person mopping your floor. His empire crumbled under the weight of his own hubris. In the epilogue of his life, he was not a king, but a punchline. Back at Carnegie Hall, Kira plays. The music she coaxes from the piano is even more profound now, imbued with the confidence of her new reality, but still retaining the fire of her past. It is the sound of vindication made permanent. The final shot is a close-up on her hands, once destined for a lifetime of cleaning chemicals, now insured for $10 million. They move over the keys with a grace and power that is almost holy. She finishes and the hall erupts. She stands, bows, and her eyes find a face in the front row. Her mother, her health restored by the best medical care money could buy, weeps with joy. Beside her sits Mrs. Park, flown in as Kira's guest of honor. This is the real reward. Not the fame, not the money. The freedom, the ability to care for those she loves, the power to honor the woman who had protected her. And now, a final question for you, the viewer, sitting in the comfortable darkness. How many geniuses did you walk past today? The barista who served you coffee, the janitor cleaning your office, the delivery driver who brought your food. How many people, cloaked in the invisibility of a service uniform, are carrying a masterpiece inside them? The world is full of hidden virtuosos, silent poets, and unsung visionaries. The story of Kira is not a fairy tale. It is a challenge.
Adare.
Look closer. See the person, not the position. You never know when you might be in the presence of greatness, waiting for a single, impossible chance to reveal itself. Don't be a Quan. Don't create a trap. Open a door. The most extraordinary things happen when you do.